Welcome to the Catch 'em and Keep 'em podcast with Melissa Glenny and Mark Altman. We're here to help you hire, engage, and retain the best talent to help you make your vision a reality.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Catch 'em Keep 'em podcast. We're happy to have you back with us today. And Mark, how are you doing?
I'm resilient as ever, Melissa Glenny. How are you?
I have been flexing those muscles like I've never flexed them in my life. I'm pretty sure that I can say that 100%.
Now, wait a second. I don't like how you did the flexing muscles. I mean, I know how much you've been working on your physical health, and you're like, I'm waiting for you to do like a Miss America competition or something.
I think I would be down to the Ironman before I'm ever going to get on the Miss America stage. But
wow, Ironman, that's ambitious.
I so admire people who can do that kind of endurance. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to be out doing any Ironmans or whatnot. I get an hour in the gym, and that's kind of an achievement for me. But hey, I know you're doing really well this year, kicking things off with some really nice new habits on the personal health front too.
Yeah, I've been getting better. I've been doing some time management things and stuff that I teach companies. I'm trying to drink my own Kool-Aid, and yeah, I have put some things into practice. Lots still to be desired, but yeah, I've been able to successfully implement a few habits. That's true.
Well, I'd give yourself more credit, because I think that the way you're doing it is so smart, and it's so smart because I think that the area where people fall down the most, especially with these New Year's resolutions and things, is that they have these grand plans and they dive headfirst into something, and then it falls apart. And I love how, from our previous talks, that how you're just taking, baby steps. I think that's the smartest thing to do for all of us.
Yeah, and I think, Melissa, I mentioned the word resiliency at the top, and I think what you just said is critical, because when people try to set themselves up for success, if the goals and milestones that they create for success aren't reasonable or aren't attainable, then that in itself will affect your resiliency, because then when you don't achieve them, your confidence goes down, your stress level goes up, and your self-esteem even goes down. So, that's a perfect example of how with resiliency, there are steps you can take to become more resilient.
Yeah, Mark, I think that you're absolutely right. Both in the having lofty goals arena, and we often think of resiliency as something that we need to pull on when we're facing something big, or we have in the face of some great adversity. But I think to your point, you're so right. We don't think about it as I'll go back to the analogy of a muscle, of something that you can build and practice over time so that it's there when you need it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's multiple examples in the workplace, whether it be, HR departments, hiring managers, senior leadership teams that get impacted by that. And I guess, Melissa, I would ask you, we're kind of at a tricky time for hiring. And I guess, whether you're hired for an organization or the organization itself is doing the recruiting, how does resiliency affect the hiring process? And if the individuals in charge of recruiting are not resilient, or frankly, if the culture of the organization isn't that of a resilient culture, what are the consequences of that?
Well, Mark, I think that, to really answer that question well, I would break down kind of how I define or how I've come to think about resiliency. And I really think that it's two things. Number one, it's the ability to withstand, and number two, the ability to adapt. So for practical purposes, the questions that I would say are always merited when you're facing something that requires resiliency is what is our contingency plan, and what is the opportunity? And I love the question, what is the opportunity? Because I'm a firm believer that things in life, and I know this is speaking very broadly outside of hiring processes, but things in life, I firmly believe, happen for us and not to us. And so that's the vantage point from which I look at resiliency and saying, you don't even have to be necessarily in a situation that's the problem, but looking at areas of your business, of your team, of your marketing strategies, whatever it might be, and thinking in terms of measuring resiliency. What are the contingency plans? Are there any? And do you see opportunities if a particular threat were to, if you were to meet a particular threat or problem? So as far as the hiring process goes, I think what I see most commonly is people who get comfortable with their process, they get comfortable with their methods and their tools, and they might see that the things over time aren't working as well. And a lot of times things get chalked up to, the market's really tight, or people just aren't who they used to be. People ghost you, and there's a whole host of reasons that the results are becoming diminished. And so essentially we continue to, when is it that, results are diminishing because of external things, and when are you just arguing for your own limitations? And so if you're not looking at it and saying, where are the contingency plans if this platform that we're working on doesn't continue to produce the same level of results that we're getting, because HR is so tech-driven, or recruiting so tech-driven now. And then looking at it as, what is the opportunity? We've had situations, and I'll just close up my thought with this, where, for whatever reason, our systems have gone down. And so we have no computers, and we rely on them 100%. And so we have to say, just stop and say, okay, well, what else are we going to do now? Because all of the tools that we use are gone at the moment, and we can't just stop. So that's how I feel resiliency. It's such an important role in the hiring process.
Well, I think you're bringing to light something that I don't think a lot of people give thought to, Melissa. And I'm a huge fan of the Serenity Prayer. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Serenity Prayer, it talks about God granting you the serenity to accept the things you can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And when you talk about contingency plans, Melissa, I think that's what's interesting, because when you develop a strategy for your organization, whether it be hiring or professional development or retention or engagement or whatever it may be, do you have a plan B? And what is the critical thinking process that goes into what could go wrong initially, and is that addressed in the plan B? So I think you touched upon something really important, because when plan A doesn't go right, it's funny, we never call it plan A. We do call it plan B. We don't call it plan A. Just an interesting little tidbit there. But when we do look at plan A, the question becomes, if plan A didn't work, is that because it wasn't well thought out, it was the wrong strategy, and are we too overconfident at times? And we tell ourselves we're being resilient because we're not giving up on plan A. We're going to see it through. Maybe it's because of COVID, it's been a bad few months. Maybe because everybody's too busy the last few months. Or can we discern between, hey, are we being overly, resilient, or artificially resilient or confident, versus discerning between, no, we need to move to plan B? Because such an aspect of resiliency is being able to bounce back, or as I like to call it, bouncing forward, right? Mm-hmm. So you just really have to, I think, Melissa, it's a critical point to understand this contingency plan. As Kenny Rogers said, know when to hold them and know when to fold them, right?
Yeah.
May he rest in peace. So I think you're really onto something there.
Well, Mark, I think you made a really good point about not. It's interesting, because I think you're so spot on in that some people look at resiliency as like, I'm holding my ground. That's resilient. And I was just picturing, as you were talking, like a portfolio of stock investments, or a portfolio of investments. it would be one thing to say, I believe so strongly in this stock, I'm going to be resilient and put everything I have in it, which I think everyone would agree is completely ridiculous. So I think the financial world really kind of has a good hold on what I see as really being resilient in diversifying and having those built-in, we keep saying it, contingency plans, knowing that, stuff's going to happen that's unexpected, and we just need to make sure that we're watching out for ourselves by not being overly reliant on, one particular thing or process or person or supply chain, whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's so tricky, Melissa, because one of the characteristics of resiliency is understanding that life is full of challenges and that we can't avoid some of the challenges, but we can remain open, flexible. But it's this big one, willing to adapt to change. And so I feel that the underlying element of a resilient culture or resilient individual is knowing, I know this is going to sound so backwards, but knowing where to place the blame. Is the blame that the plan was wrong in the first place? Is the blame that your role in developing the plan and your ability to execute the plan was at fault? Or is it neither? And it's just stay the course and stay resilient and understand that there's ups and downs. And I think it's the resilient people can discern between those three scenarios.
I think you make a really good point. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I think I was thinking along the lines of the last example that you gave, that things evolve and expire, and being able to watch out for that stuff. But that's an interesting idea of being able to kind of dissect that and do some root cause analysis, because I think there's a lot of learning opportunity in that.
We're going to move on and talk about how resiliency plays into your communication and change management within your organization. If these topics that Mark and I bring to you every month resonate and help you hire, train, and lead your people, then you can follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or YouTube, and make sure you don't miss an episode. We appreciate your interest and your investment of time in yourself. And thanks for liking, sharing, and for your comments.
When you're working with organizations, you do a lot around change management and communication of that. And I think that resiliency, you use the term a resilient culture. And I think that plays right in tandem with the success of communicating change and the success of rolling change out in organizations. So how does an organization improve internal communications around change and around building a resilient culture?
Well, Melissa, I'm gonna give you a very quick anecdote to answer that question. And this is the anecdote. I'm pretty open about that. I see a therapist, and I reached out to my therapist the other day to say that I wanted to see her less because I feel like I'm doing pretty well, and even though she's a good resource for me, and she's actually a former trainer, corporate trainer, so she does really understand my world. But the point being that I texted her and I said, hey, I think we can go to every other week. And her response was, well, that's rather abrupt. What prompted that? And I said, oh, actually, no, it's not abrupt at all. I've been thinking about it for the last 2 or 3 months. And her response was, well, it may not be abrupt to you, but it's abrupt to me because I didn't know you were thinking that. And I thought to myself, boy, if that isn't change management to a T. So when an organization makes a change, the people being affected by the change, do you actually take the time? It may not seem like a big deal to you because, hey, the company isn't doing well, so we have to adapt and adjust. Or COVID's hit, so we have to adapt and adjust. And it's a very matter-of-fact step to take. But do you actually take the time to think of how the other person's going to receive the information? Because it's going to affect their confidence, their resiliency, their engagement level. And it basically comes down to this, Melissa. If you want your organization to have a resilient culture, every time you need to announce a change that could be received controversially or could create negativity or conflict, You have to understand how the change will impact yourself, meaning you're going to be the one to have to communicate that change on down. Are you in favor of it? How do you, can you filter out your own feelings and emotions about the change? How it'll impact the individuals in the organization, how it'll affect the different teams in the organization, and how it'll affect the different levels of management in the organization. And
Mm.
to really thoughtfully communicate change so you have a resilient culture, it's not simple. It's there's a process, it's an art form, and every time you try to cheat it and shortcut it, engagement and culture and productivity gets very much adversely affected.
So are you saying, that's such an interesting example, and I can, it really helps drive the point home, I think, that you're trying to make for me when you tell the story about the communication with your therapist. And I think you're still right. Having worked in some large corporations myself over the years, sometimes at the ground level, it would seem like they were suddenly just blowing up plans, and that it would be like, oh great, now what? Is that kind of what you're referring to, where is it just a lack of the communication from the upper levels of the organization down to the ground? Is that where there needs to be improvement in what frequency or method, or both?
Well, there's a couple of things. I don't think it's the lack of communication. I think it's the method of communication. And I'll give
Okay.
you two very specific examples. So if you have a very large organization, what are your choices to communicate change? Well, you have email, you have a company newsletter, but what you also have is, since everything is so virtual now, you have the opportunity to have virtual communication accompanied by an email. And so I think because everybody's so pressed for time, the personal touch of the communication is getting lost. And one of my golden rules of communication is you do not deliver bad news solely with an email.
Mm.
And so I think it starts there, Melissa. But I think the greater problem is that as change filters down the different levels of management and organization, do the lower levels or mid levels of management know how to effectively communicate the change? And what I mean by communicate is, do they know how to communicate the rationale and the why the change was made? Do they know what kind of pushback they're going to get when they communicate the change? And are they prepared to respond to that pushback? And I don't think mid-level and low-level managers are trained enough by senior management to get out in front of change proactively to cut negativity off at the pass, as opposed to reactively when someone gets an email and people start complaining. So I think that's a big element also.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up mid-level managers. There's a special place in my heart for mid-level managers. I think that it's like being in a stress sandwich. You've got pull from below and pull from above. Sometimes that's, I think, the toughest spot. And in reflecting on experiences as a middle manager, sometimes you have to be the raving fan for something that's getting rolled out that you don't necessarily support yourself. Well, I shouldn't say a support, but you don't agree with it, but you got to do it, and you have to champion it to keep everybody kind of marching to the same drum. Do you have any advice for individuals in that position specifically?
Well, I do. And I think what typically happens when changes are made is that, there's a vote, okay? In a lot of cases, if it isn't an autocratic ruling system, there's a vote. So if you've got 10 senior leaders at the table and 7 people vote for it and 3 against it, then the person at the head of the table goes, okay, well, we voted, so we're going to have to move forward with this. But then it ends there, as opposed to, we're going to have to move forward with this. For the people that aren't on board with this change or didn't agree with the change, are you concerned in your ability to communicate it to support the greater mission and vision of the organization? And I don't think that conversation's taking place. And if it doesn't take place at the top level, that when those senior managers or leaders start communicating with the mid levels, as you just referred to, it's going to affect their motivation and confidence and passion in selling that change and that message. So I think it's one thing to have 100% agreement, but to me, the goal is going to be rarely to get 100% agreement. But for the people who aren't agreeing, do you still have their support, and are they going to be able to communicate authentically that this is the right thing to do, even if they don't 100% agree with it? And that's what I teach senior leadership teams to consider.
That's a great point. You know what? Just total kind of tangent here with an anecdote on that. One thing that I learned in my business that seemed to kind of, whenever I knew, because you talked about preempting messages that might not be met with great enthusiasm, I guess would be softer to say it. But I often would, when I had to announce a change, aside from some specifics, kind of making sure I included certain information so everyone could kind of understand the big picture and understand how we arrived at the decision. But I found that if we said, listen, we're gonna do this for 3 months or 6 months, or we're gonna commit to this for a year, and then essentially kind of paint it so that we're going to be accepting feedback, so you don't need to just take it and shut up. Like we want to hear your voice. I think sometimes just that message that we want to continue to listen to you really helps to kind of put people at ease a little bit.
Well, Melissa, I think what you said is the most important thing for listeners to take away from this podcast, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of times, I think leaders don't value what they just said, because the only way they would value it is if they thought people were going to actually embrace the change. And so sometimes changes have to take place, and people aren't going to be happy, and they're being done for the greater good. But even if you can't make someone feel better and change their mind about the change happening, you could still be available to help, to be empathetic and understand their thought process and listen. And that's the investment of time that is often lacking in change management. But if people at least feel heard, they're way more likely to embrace and accept the change, as opposed to just seeing an email saying, here's what we're doing.
Yeah. Man, there's really something magical about people feeling heard.
So much.
Yeah.
So, well, and so Melissa, so final thoughts, final question for me that I would want to ask you is, what recommendations do you make for people in charge of recruiting and retention around resiliency and change? Because at the end of the day, unemployment rates go up and down, the economy goes up and down, the needs of organizations of hiring are constantly changing. So I would imagine you run into situations where people are overwhelmed with the amount of change as they're trying to execute their job in HR as a hiring manager. And so what do you typically give them for advice to stay resilient, but stay as a critical thinker also?
I think that, I don't want to lean on something that sounds so cliche, but it's just so true that what gets measured gets done. And so I think that it's really important to measure whatever the key performance indicators are that helps you in whatever, in the particular environment that you're in, because they could be different for different hiring managers and different types of companies and situations. But if you can establish key performance indicators and really stay true to those on a weekly basis, and make sure that you're watching the trends. And I think trends are so important. And from those indicators and trends, keep asking the question, what is our contingency plan? And then what would be the opportunity in a contingency plan? So if I'll give you some examples, because it might sound a little kind of arbitrary right now, but who's moving into your market, who could potentially be recruiting out of your company? What's happening with the technologies, platforms, whereas, for example, people today are responding drastically less to emails than they did 3 years ago. And text is taking over. So are you paying attention to that? Like, are you measuring how many people are responding to you, or how many people are applying to your jobs, and then how many people are responding to you when you reach out? If you're not measuring, you don't know what's happening and what's causing things to happen. All you know is you're having more and more difficulty filling your position. So, in closing, my final takeaway is you've got to be measuring. You've got to be asking what's on the horizon. Where do we need to have contingency plans? And make sure you're capturing opportunities. Never stop asking, where's the opportunity?
Yeah, and I have one very simple thing to add to what you just said, and that is, if you're the kind of organization or individual who has not set these kind of KPIs or goals in the past, and your attitude is, well, I don't even know where to begin, just pick something. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exact. You can always modify the KPIs and goals as you start tracking and collecting data, but don't not do it because you wouldn't know where to start. Pick something.
Oh, that's such a great point, Mark, because one will lead to the next, to the next, to the next as you start thinking of terms. Yeah, such a great point.
All right, Melissa, well, we love Catch 'em, Keep 'em.
Yeah, Mark, I learned a lot today. I really appreciate, as always, you taking the time out to share your perspectives on these really important topics. So thank you, and thanks to our listeners. We're looking forward to seeing how things continue to shake out, and see you next month.
Yeah, awesome. Likewise, Melissa. Love partnering with you on this, and we'll see you next time.
All right, take good care.
Thanks for joining us on the Catch 'em and Keep 'em podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss us next time. In the meantime, remember that engaging your people is a daily task, and recruiting is a process, not an event. If you need help, just ask. Connect directly with Melissa at franklinprofessionals.com and Mark at mindsetgo.com.